Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Muhammad Kubaib. In this video, we will discuss about Azure Bastion service. If you find this video useful, please subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you will get notified whenever I upload any new videos related to VDA or public cloud. Azure Bastion service is a PaaS service that provides seamless RDP and SSH connectivity to your virtual machine over SSL without having any public IP address on the virtual machine. So basically you can access your virtual machine over the internet without having any public IP address defined on the VM level. The key benefit of using Azure Bastion service is RDP and SSH through Azure portal, and it is purely a TLS session and no IP address is required on the virtual machine. However, Azure Bastion service, it's not a free service, so it is built based on the usage. Let's say you have VNet. In this VNet you have multiple subnets and you have a virtual machine. So this is the internet and this is the on-premise location. So let's say from the internet you wanted to take a remote of this VM. Should have a public IP address. So when you have a public IP address from your PC, you can directly access the virtual machine hosted in Azure over the public IP address. And from your on-premise location, if you wanted to take a remote of this VM, you can take the remote using the private IP address, but you should have a site-to-site VPN connectivity or express route. So these are the prerequisites to take a remote of your virtual machine which is hosted in Azure. So when it comes to security, it is not at all recommended to have public IP address on the virtual machine because it will expose your virtual machine to the internet and it is very vulnerable to any attacks. So how we can take a remote of your Azure virtual desktop or any VM hosted in Azure without having public IP address? There comes Azure Bastion service. Let's see how the Azure Bastion service works. Let's say you have a VNet. In this VNet you have two subnets. Let's say subnet 1 and subnet 2. So in the first subnet you will have a VM which is having a private IP address and it doesn't have any public IP address. So this is the internet and you wanted to take remote of this VM from the internet, which is not possible when you have private IP address. So let's see how we can configure Azure Bastion to access the VM through the private IP address itself. So to do that, we need to define a subnet which is dedicated for Azure Bastion service. Azure Bastion service. So once we deploy the subnet, then we need to create a Azure Bastion service. Azure Bastion service, basically it will deploy a virtual machine on this subnet and it will assign a public IP address for this virtual machine. So this process is completely invisible to the user. So the moment we activate Azure Bastion service, in the backend it will provision the virtual machine and we need to assign a public IP address for that virtual machine. This virtual machine is not visible to the administrator. It is purely handled in the backend by Microsoft. So let's say the user wanted to access the virtual machine which is in the Azure, which doesn't have any public IP address. So the first initial connection, it will go to the Azure Bastion host on the port 443 over the public IP address of the Azure Bastion service. Then the Bastion service will connect you to your backend virtual machine over the private IP address on port 3389 if it Windows or VM, or SSH it will connect on port 22. This is how you can access your VM over the internet without having any public IP address assigned to the virtual machine. So now Azure Bastion supports VNet peering as well. The meaning of this is, let's say this is your hub VNet and this is your Spock VNet. Let's say you have multiple VNets, and earlier, to have Bastion service, you have to deploy the Bastion host on each VNet, then only you can able to take VM inside that VNet. But now, since it supports VNet peering, so you can deploy your Bastion host in the hub VNet, and if you have a VNet peering with other Spock VNet, you can access all your VMs hosted in the individual VNet over the hub Bastion host. So that it removes the dependency of creating Azure Bastion host on individual VNets. The prerequisites to deploy Azure Bastion service: first we should have a VNet, and then we need to have a subnet named Azure Bastion service. It should be either /26 or greater than this, and then we should have a public IP address, and the user account which we are using to access our VM should have a reader role on the virtual machine and the NIC. So the best way, either you can give a reader access on the resource group level or subscription level, so that it will apply on all the VMs in your subscription. However, it does not support Azure Active Directory user, so it should be only the hybrid users to take the remote of your virtual machine. If you are using network security groups in your Azure infra, then you have to allow some inbound and outbound rules, which includes inbound port 443 from the internet and port 443 from the gateway manager and Azure load balancer. Then you have to allow port 8080 and 5701 from the virtual network. When it comes to outbound rules, we have to allow port 22 and 3389 to virtual network, and port 443 to the Azure cloud, and port 8080 and 5701, which is required for Bastion communication, to the virtual network. Then to the internet we need to allow port 80. So these are the inbound and outbound security rules which we have to define in the network security group, which is attached to the Azure Bastion subnet. To create a Bastion service, first we need to create a subnet. So let's go to our virtual network. I am choosing workload VNet in my example, and it is hosted in West US. So let's go to the VNet, and under that select subnet. Here click on subnet and enter the name Azure Bastion subnet. So the name should be exactly like this, and the subnet 10.196.1.0/24 I am choosing, so you can choose as per your requirement. Then hit on save. The subnet is ready. So let's go to the search blade and search for Bastion. Click on Bastion, and here click on create Bastion. So under resource group, select the resource group which you want to place this service, and name I'm going to enter as demo Bastion. The region I'm going to keep it in West US2, the same as my virtual network. And under virtual network we need to select the virtual network, and automatically it will pick the subnet which we have created earlier. So we need to have a public IP address for this Bastion host. So if you have already created, you can use existing, but if you do not have anything ready, so you can select create new. So Azure will automatically create it for you. So here I am choosing create new, and then click on review and create. The validation is completed. Now we can hit on create. Now the deployment is completed. Let's go to the resource. This is the overview of Azure Bastion host. Let's assign a reader permission to the user who is going to access the VM through Bastion. I'm going to define the reader role on the subscription level. So you can choose either resource group or resource level as well. Let's go to the subscription, select the subscription and select access control. Here click on add role assignment. So I'll choose a reader role. I'll click next. Here I will define my user. This should be the hybrid user, which is synchronized from the on-premise Active Directory through Azure AD Connect. Click the user and then review and assign. Now we have assigned reader role to our user so that the user can take remote over the Bastion host. I have a virtual machine over here, that is avdnp-3, which doesn't have any public IP address and it has only private IP address, which is 10.196.0.5, as you can see over here. So we'll see how we can take a remote of this VM through Azure Bastion service. To do that, first we need to click on connect, hit on Bastion. So here we need to enter the username. So let's enter our user ID and enter the password, and then we can click on connect. So now it will open a new tab and it will try to connect to the VM through Azure Bastion host. As you can see, now it is logging in and I have logged into my Windows 11 VM over the private IP address through Azure Bastion host. So this is how you can utilize Azure Bastion host to access your VMs without having public IP address defined on the Azure VM. So this is very helpful when it comes to Azure Virtual Desktop or Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop Service. So you can use Azure Bastion host to access your master image VMs from the internet. Let's say if you are not in the office network, or if you do not have any site-to-site or express route connections and you wanted to do some changes on your images, etc., then you can utilize Azure Bastion host to connect your master image VMs and you can do the activities through Azure Bastion without having any public IP defined on the master image. So if you go back to the Bastion and if you go to the sessions where you can see the connected session details, as you can see over here that Bastion host is connected to the VM name called avdnp-3, and this is the user details and this is the private IP address of the virtual machine, and this is the protocol it is used to connect to the VM. So this is how we can utilize Azure Bastion service. So we have covered what is Azure Bastion service and what is the prerequisites and how to create Azure Bastion host and how to use it to take the VM remote from the internet without having any IP address. Thank you for watching the video.